In this video, we will be discussing carbohydrate applications for athletes. So after kind of establishing the energy requirement for athletes and determining really how much food or how much energy an athlete should be eating, the next step comes to how do we identify what types of foods and how much of those key macronutrients should we be recommending to different types of athletes. Herein enter carbohydrates. In my opinion, probably one of the most important nutrients for athletes, specifically if we look at more intermittent, kind of high intensity team sports, and then certainly our endurance athletes and endurance type competitions. Carbohydrates is such an important fuel source for those athletes because of the energy system involvement to kind of support those types of activities, especially over the duration of those kinds of activities. If we think hour, 2 hour, 3 hours and beyond, carbohydrates are going to play a very important role in maintaining kind of energy levels throughout that type of competition. So again, for any athlete involved in those types of activities, whether it be a competition, a game, and then certainly the training required to prepare athletes for those kinds of competitions and events, carbohydrate is really their go-to fuel source day in and day out. And as we will kind of get into here, the caveat with carbohydrates is there's just a finite amount that we have stored and readily available within the body. So we'll get into this a little bit later, but when we digest carbohydrates, we can store it in the liver or skeletal muscle tissue in the form of glycogen. However, it's really only a couple hours worth of kind of stored carbs that we have available. We can kind of delay or supplement with exogenous sources of carbohydrates to extend that kind of depletion of stored carbohydrates. So we can do things like sports drinks, gels, snacks, et cetera, to provide additional sources of carbohydrates. But still, there may be a point in time where we just kind of run out of that fuel source. And then usually we have to drop intensity of effort or the onset of fatigue may kind of come into play there. So it's really, really important to make sure athletes are consistently ingesting enough carbohydrates to kind of continually restock their stored carbohydrate sources and then kind of keep that gas tank full is one kind of analogy that we can kind of use. And so the timing and kind of recommendations of when and how much carbohydrates should be recommended to athletes is really going to be based on the type of sport, maybe their competition schedule, and then similarly their training schedule in terms of how much and then when we're going to start recommending different sources of carbohydrates in kind of throughout their diet. And so in this video, we'll discuss some of the different types of carbohydrates, how the different type will then impact how they're digested, how they're kind of used within the body, and then ultimately what types of recommendations we're going to start kind of recommending for people and when. So there's a few different ways that we can kind of describe different categories of carbohydrates. So in this table here, we have a couple different ways that we can represent this. We have what's commonly referred to as sugars or simple sources of carbohydrates. So these are things like fruit juices, sports drinks, kind of cereals, candy, kind of fast digesting and really kind of fast sources of these carbohydrates in the diet. Then we also have starches or maybe more of our complex type carbohydrates. So cereals, potatoes, pasta, whole wheat, kind of breads and rice and noodles and things like that would be kind of what we would consider more starch-based sources of carbohydrates, or kind of complex carbohydrates is another term sometimes used. And then we have fiber, which is found in a lot of fruits and vegetables, and then some whole food versions of cereals, breads, pastas, maybe are fortified with fiber or have additional fiber in them, making them good sources of fiber, which is again a type of carbohydrate that we'll discuss here shortly. So from kind of a molecular standpoint, we can also classify different types of carbohydrates based on the units of sugar molecules that are kind of found or bound together. So carbohydrates are essentially just made up of a string of different sugar molecules, or saccharides is another term used to describe that. And these are primarily found in the diet and again, some of the different food products that I mentioned earlier. And so within the human body, glucose is really the primary form of carbohydrate that we store and we can use to kind of support metabolism and some of the different energy systems involved with kind of taking stored carbohydrates and converting them into cellular energy. And then lactose is really the only kind of plentiful animal-based carbohydrate, which again is primarily found in dairy-based products, milk, yogurt, cheese, etc. And then sucrose is another known kind of form of carbohydrate, referred to as kind of white sugar. So it would be a simple carbohydrate source. And then vegetables are the ones that will contain cellulose, which is classified as a complex form of carbohydrate that is really indigestible to humans. And this is again what we would also refer to as fiber. So we can also again look at kind of the types of carbohydrate terminology that's used to describe how many of those sugar units are bound together. So we have monosaccharides, which would be glucose, fructose, and galactose. So these are examples of some of the different single sugar molecule units that are out there. And then when we form or combine these simple sugars or monosaccharides together, we get disaccharides based on, again, the different single carbohydrate units that were bound together. So maltose, for example, would be two glucose molecules bound together, et cetera, here down the list. And then polysaccharides, these are, again, those complex carbohydrates that represent multiple units of these sugar molecules or monosaccharides that are bound together in the form of either starch, glycogen, again, which is the storage form of glucose within the human body, and then cellulose, again, that's found primarily in kind of plant-based foods that are sources of fiber in the diet. So again, here we have a longer list of some of the examples of carbohydrate-rich foods in which you could find some of these different types or classifications of carbohydrates. So monosaccharides, again, we have the glucose, fructose, and galactose. Here again, we have the different kind of sources of these or options. And then disaccharides, again, represent, some of the different more common food-based versions of these that are found either in dairy products or table sugar or malt sugar. And then we get into more of our complex carbohydrates that are typically found in processed versions of some of these foods, like again, breads, pastas, et cetera. And then fiber would be kind of the last source that again are primarily found in different plant-based carbohydrate sources. If we look at the digestion of carbohydrates, this actually starts in the mouth. So we have different enzymes in our mouth that actually kind of start the digestion process. And so we can actually even absorb some of the digested carbohydrates almost immediately upon eating them. Thankful or as a result of some of these mouth-based enzymes that again kind of start that digestion process. So collectively, glucose represents about 80% of the available carbohydrate, with fructose providing the remaining 10% and galactose kind of the other 10%. So this is kind of typical within humans in which sources of carbohydrates are really available to support some of the different metabolic processes. Again, following not only digestion, but then also absorption of these different sugars kind of into circulation. And so again, depending on the type of sugar, there are specific enzymes involved with kind of digesting that particular string or type of carbohydrate. So with, for example, in the mouth, we have amylase, which is one of the enzymes in the oral cavity that again begins to split some of these starch molecules into the smaller units, such as disaccharides and then monosaccharides. And then again, just going back through those different specific sugar molecules, you can see here we again have some different enzymes throughout the body that play a role in digesting that particular sugar molecule. You may note lactase is again the one responsible for digesting lactose. And so if you're lactose intolerant, your body doesn't produce a lot of this enzyme. So sometimes people either avoid dairy outright or supplement with things like Lactaid, which is just an exogenous source of this enzyme to help you kind of digest that and avoid any kind of GI discomfort that could come from undigested lactose kind of throughout the GI system. If we look at carbohydrate transport, after the carbohydrates are broken down into either glucose, fructose, or galactose, they are then transported kind of through the gut membrane and gut lining through that intestinal lumen. And that occurs with the help of different transport proteins that then allow us to kind of absorb and transport these sugar molecules throughout circulation. Now, what that also does is it increases blood sugar levels or blood glucose values. And then our body kind of responds to that by releasing insulin that helps promote the uptake of glucose into the different tissues throughout the body. Here with glucose The two primary ones will be skeletal muscle tissue and then liver, where we ultimately will convert that glucose to glycogen to kind of store and save for later use, or it might be used somewhat immediately following uptake to support glycolysis or any kind of metabolic activities that may be ongoing, especially if someone happens to be exercising and really needs rapid supplies of that glucose to support an elevated metabolic activity. So if there's too much insulin that might be released, sometimes we get this rebound hypoglycemia in which we're actually going to have a low blood sugar response because our body kind of over-released insulin, which again promoted the uptake of glucose, but it almost did too good of a job. And now all of a sudden someone feels a little bit lightheaded, maybe somewhat nauseous and tachycardic. That's again kind of symptoms based on this hypoglycemia response. You could kind of counteract that by eating something additionally, maybe something that's a little bit slower digesting to kind of slowly release and stabilize blood sugar levels throughout circulation. And if we look at some of the more kind of fast-acting versions of carbohydrate supplementation, such as sports drinks, the most common sugars that are typically found in those types of beverages will be glucose, fructose, and then sucrose, all ones that are, again, kind of fast-acting sugars, which is kind of what we want with a sports drink. We want to digest, absorb, and transport that almost immediately because we need that supply of sugar as soon as possible to support kind of that elevated metabolic activity and kind of elevated rate of glycolysis during those types of tasks. Fructose does tend to be absorbed more slowly if we compare it to just glucose alone. It doesn't really quite create the same excessive changes in blood sugar, but that it does also sometimes draw water into the intestine and can therefore cause cramping, diarrhea, or other kind of GI distress. So sometimes people should be a little bit mindful of consuming foods or fruits that are high in fructose during some of those particular activities or training sessions or competitions because there is slightly higher risk of some of that GI upset in those types of situations. And so we can actually quantify this kind of carbohydrate, absorption and then subsequent GI or glycemic index type response is kind of what it's referred to as. So this is a metric that is used to really kind of describe the glucose and insulin response that follows eating a particular type of food that tends to be higher in carbohydrates. So glycemic index is this unit or scale that we use kind of based on a reference to a common sugar, glucose or dextrose and the subsequent response. So GI or glycemic index of 100 would kind of be the highest or on the higher end of this glycemic index response that would represent a fast acting or kind of simple sugar, resulting in this really rapid rise in blood sugar levels and then also subsequent rise in insulin levels, which again, for the general population isn't really ideal because they don't really need that fast acting sugar in a timely fashion. But for athletes who, again, might be during a halftime or a transition during a triathlon, they need those sugars almost immediately. And so we would want to maybe opt for a high glycemic index food or beverage during those types of situations. But if it's an off day or if it's early in the day and they're eating breakfast, then maybe opting for a lower glycemic index food or carbohydrate would be more ideal because it would kind of lead to more of a slower rise in blood glucose levels and then a slower rise in insulin levels, kind of creating a more stable blood glucose profile kind of throughout the morning or throughout the day. And again, for general population, that's usually what we aim for. And then again, with athletes, there are those unique circumstances where we would want to provide them with these high glycemic index foods or simple sugars to, again, provide that rapid source of carbohydrate when their bodies really need it the most. And so again, this blood glucose glycemic index curve is kind of what's represented here that can kind of demonstrate just the comparisons of what that blood glucose response would look like if we were to consume a high glycemic index source of carbohydrate. Again, we'd get that rapid rise in blood sugar, and then it would kind of come down as insulin is released. Sometimes it even goes below kind of baseline levels with that rebound hypoglycemia condition that I mentioned earlier. Comparatively, if we look at more of a lower glycemic index food, we would get more of a slow rise in blood sugar levels and then just kind of a slow decline because we don't get that robust spike in insulin. So we get more kind of stable blood glucose levels. This is why, again, people usually recommend more complex, slower digesting carbohydrates to be kind of the backbone of carbohydrate feeding throughout the day. And then we just select maybe these higher glycemic index ones for athletes, people who are exercising intensely and really kind of need that fast acting source of glucose in the diet. And so again, this is what we can kind of look to in terms of dictating what kinds of carbohydrates we're going to recommend when. So here in this table, you can kind of just see some different examples of what we consider higher glycemic index foods, candy, honey, syrup, certainly sucrose and glucose, versus medium and then even lower glycemic index foods, which again have some different fruits items in there or things like yogurt or other items that again would maybe create more of a slower rise in blood glucose and then slower rise in insulin levels following the digestion and absorption of those different nutrients. And then we also have fiber, which is another kind of type of carbohydrate that also can help kind of stabilize blood sugar levels and create more of a slower rise in blood glucose and then also slower rise in insulin levels because it's really non-digestible and it's what really kind of creates the structural components of fruits and vegetables. And so fiber has a number of useful functions, including providing just kind of bulk substance to the diet, which can help slow digestion, kind of maximize the absorption of nutrients and then also just kind of better stabilizing blood sugar levels and things like that. It does tend to increase satiety levels, so it kind of makes people feel a little bit more full, can kind of help promote GI health, and then also absorbs other kind of, potentially noxious materials found in foods and assists in the excretion of kind of waste products or unused items such as cholesterol or other kind of minerals. And so with fiber, we actually have two different types. We have what's called soluble fiber. So this attracts water during the digestion process and actually turns it into kind of a gelatinous material that will kind of create like a sludge and actually slows digestion down. So think of things like oat bran, barley nut seeds, beans, lentils, peas, some types of fruits and vegetables will also have soluble fiber. And then we have insoluble fiber that actually speeds the passage of foods through the stomach and intestines and adds more bulk substance to the diet. So this is things like wheat bran, raw vegetables, certain whole grains will also be sources of insoluble fiber in the diet. And so usually we kind of recommend a combination of the two, both soluble and insoluble fiber. And again, these are mostly non-digestible for the most part, commonly found in different plants, fruits and vegetables. And usually with either dietary or functional fiber, we kind of add these two together to equate to the total fiber intake of the diet. And usually there's specific recommendations on kind of daily fiber intake, usually anywhere from 20 to 30 grams, depending on the age or kind of dietary status of the individual. But that's kind of roughly what we aim for, depending on, again, kind of their health profile or what their needs may be. So this just kind of maps out the complex pathways and metabolic pathways that are involved in some of the different energy systems and ultimately the fate of different carbohydrates. So you can see here quite complex in terms of how glucose and fructose and things of that nature play a role in supporting metabolism and can be used as key substrates during, again, different bouts of activity or sport related activities that require really a high rate of glucose utilization. Specifically, if we're looking at kind of glycolysis and the aerobic energy system, both of which are very reliant on sources of carbohydrates and carbohydrate availability to support ATP production during those types of activities. So if we look at kind of the sources of carbohydrate during exercise, so again, now let's say on a bike, we're exercising, rates of glycolysis and aerobic metabolism are now being upregulated. And so we're rapidly using glucose to kind of support those metabolic pathways. And so again, we have a couple different options here within the human body to provide that source of glucose. We have some circulating glucose found in the blood, and then we also have stored glycogen in both skeletal muscle tissue and liver glycogen. And so if we look at which one is used first, liver glycogen is really used as kind of a maintenance supply of blood glucose during just everyday activities. As we're walking around, sitting, we're really relying on liver glycogen to provide kind of that steady supply of glucose to circulation. And then it actually will become depleted after about 12 to 18 hours of fasting. We kind of run out of liver glycogen. Whereas muscle glycogen is more of our primary glucose source during exercise, which makes sense. It's much closer in terms of proximity, right? We're using glucose in skeletal muscle, in the mitochondria, or kind of cytosol within the cell to support either glycolysis or aerobic metabolism. And so if we can store it right there in the muscle, we may as well use that supply first, right? So that's kind of the primary source of glucose during different types of activity. And then if we kind of plot out substrate use or glycogen utilization kind of throughout exercise, we can kind of see here how these factors are going to kind of dictate carbohydrate recommendations for different types of individuals. So here going across the x-axis, we have kind of a time duration profile, meaning someone who's exercising at like steady state, let's say 70% of VO2 max for a 4 hour period. So during the early stages, the first hour, the percent of energy expenditure is primarily coming from muscle glycogen, right? You can see here almost half of it's coming from muscle glycogen, a small percentage coming from blood glucose. We're also using some free fatty acids for ATP production. Again, this would also be indicative of submaximal exercise. This curve would look a little different if it was maximal effort. And then we're also using some stored muscle triglycerides, so some stored fat within the muscle as well. So almost kind of an even mixture there of fats and carbohydrates to provide sources of fuel. And then as we kind of progress out over the course of the 4 hours, you can see towards the end, we're less reliant on muscle glycogen. That's because we're essentially kind of running out of stored glycogen at that time point. And then also we're kind of becoming more reliant on free fatty acids and then also blood glucose during those later hours of bouts of activity as well. And then so we can also look at source of blood glucose values during kind of a normal day. You can kind of see, again, depending on meal timing and things of that nature, these blood glucose values are going to fluctuate quite a bit, obviously based on what kinds of foods you're eating and when. So if we look at breakfast, lunch, and dinner, you can see those spikes in dietary sources of carbohydrate. And then as we digest and absorb those glucose molecules and probably uptake them into muscle and liver tissue, in lieu of that, we see some kind of replacement sources of carbohydrate in the blood coming from either stored glycogen or actually the production of new glucose molecules from non-carbohydrate sources, which is what we call gluconeogenesis. So those kind of also provide sources of glucose in circulation, again, depending on meal timing, and then obviously meal composition as well would play a role in that kind of blood glucose profile throughout the day. And so again, if we look at muscle glycogen levels and kind of how those values change across time, it's very, very dependent upon the intensity of effort. So if we look at just kind of lower intensity activities, we would see much more of a slower decline in muscle glycogen levels over the course of that 3 hour period. Whereas if we're going to maybe from 30% VO2 max upwards to 60%, you can see a steeper drop off. And then same trend as we go to 80% VO2 max, and certainly at the super maximal levels, muscle glycogen levels become that much more depleted, that much more quickly. Okay, so there's a definite dose response relationship in terms of the intensity of effort and the rate of muscle glycogen depletion, meaning the harder you're training or the harder you're working out, the quicker you're going to deplete stored glycogen values, meaning we have to feed that kind of athlete more and more carbohydrates throughout the day prior, and then also considering supplementing with additional sources such as gels, sports drinks, etc., during those types of activities. Now, if we look at kind of the intensity and duration and how that impacts liver glucose output, we almost kind of see the reverse of this. So at higher intensities of exercise, we're going to get more glucose output coming from the liver during that highest level of exercise intensity over that time course. Again, over here, it's only looking at about a 40-minute duration, whereas lower intensities of effort don't require as rapid release of glucose from the liver. So we see a little bit slower of a hepatic glucose output during those lower intensity bouts of exercise and activity. Now, this really, again, kind of sets the stage for why we usually recommend a high carbohydrate diet for a lot of active individuals and certainly for athletes, as I alluded to earlier. Even further, carbohydrates are very important for our endurance athletes who, again, are competing or training for hours and hours a day. And then also for our intermittent, high intensity kind of team sport or field sport activities such as soccer, lacrosse, field hockey. You could probably even include sports like basketball, hockey in there as well. All of those are going to, all those sports again are going to be pretty dependent on stored muscle glycogen and blood glucose availability. And so there's again this direct response or direct relationship that we usually see with initial muscle glycogen levels and how long someone's going to be able to exercise before the onset of fatigue. So here, the way we would interpret this figure is if you have the highest initial muscle glycogen levels, let's say we have one person at 3.5, one person at 2, one person at a half in terms of a gram per 100 grams of dry muscle weight. So if we have these three different people and then we say, all right, we want you to exercise at 70% of VO2 max and just go as long as you can, that person who is on the high carbohydrate diet, who had the highest initial muscle glycogen levels, they are going to be able to go for about 3 hours before the onset of fatigue. That person following a moderate diet, they're not going to have as high of resting glycogen levels, so they're only going to go about 2 hours before the onset of fatigue. And the person who is on a low carbohydrate diet, they're going to have very low resting muscle glycogen levels. They're only going to be going about an hour. So this really kind of provides the rationale for why we recommend a high carbohydrate diet to athletes. And then also why it's important for athletes to be mindful of what they're eating the days before competition and then even the day of or morning of to make sure they kind of have topped off their glycogen stores because it really plays a big role in how long they're able to perform or compete before the onset of fatigue. Okay, so this figure is really important to kind of reiterate that importance and that reliance of not only acute consumption or ingestion of carbohydrate, but then also just consistent ingestion as well, and making sure glycogen values are always kind of topped off at their highest values as much as possible. And so here, as blood glucose levels, or the way we would interpret this figure, I should say, we'll take a step back here. So this is looking at muscle glycogen levels and then how they change across exercise time. So as we start to exercise and go from a time point of 0 all the way to about 3 hours, here you can kind of see muscle glycogen levels represented in the light blue line. They start at their highest point, and then as we exercise longer and longer, those values start to become more and more diminished until the point of kind of glycogen depletion here around the 3 hour mark. And then you can see the perceptions of fatigue kind of follow an opposing curve here. So you start to feel more and more tired as your glycogen levels start to become more and more depleted. And usually that will contribute to the onset of fatigue. Again, certainly after a few hours of physical activity. And again, this is probably a moderate to high exercise intensity. Obviously, it's not maximal effort, or there's no way you're lasting 3 hours. So this is probably more of a 60 to 75% VO2 max type of exercise intensity. And so this concept, again, is very important over the course of several days if we're looking at athletes who are in a tournament or who compete multiple days a week or just really have an intense training block where they're training 2 to 3 hours a day every day of the week. It's really important to try to keep up with high carbohydrate feeding strategies to make sure you're continually replenishing muscle and liver glycogen and then even blood glucose values really kind of as consistently as possible throughout the week. And so if we were to compare two different types of athletes, we put one on like a high carbohydrate diet and the other person on a low carbohydrate diet. And then we say, okay, every day we want you to go out and run 16 kilometers. And we again kind of compare what happens in terms of glycogen levels across those two different types of diets and across those two different people. So that person who is on, well, let's even start here. So after the first day of this, both people maybe started with pretty high muscle glycogen levels, and then after that 16-kilometer run, both experience a pretty significant drop in muscle glycogen, which we would expect just based on the previous slides here. And then again, we put people on two different diets. So one of them, we're recommending a high carb diet. The other one's going to stay on a low carb diet. And we're just going to kind of continue this over the course of 3 days. You can see that person on the high carb diet is able to kind of replenish muscle glycogen levels and start with near baseline values before each of these subsequent bouts of running, which are marked with that little blue figure here. Whereas that person on the low carbohydrate diet, you can see they're never able to kind of replenish muscle glycogen levels and actually just slowly experience a further and further drop in muscle glycogen over the course of those 3 days. There aren't performance metrics on here, but you would probably imagine that person on the low carbohydrate diet's really not feeling well. They probably didn't run as well during that second and third run. And so, again, just reiterating the point of making sure athletes are consistently fueling with high carbohydrate intakes, especially if they have multiple competitions throughout the week or have really intense training blocks throughout the week to make sure they're kind of consistently replenishing muscle glycogen stores and values as much as possible. And so here again is another kind of figure that reiterates this point, but this is actually looking at a 100-kilometer time trial performance, and then how it is kind of impacted by either 6 days of low carb diet versus 6 days of high carbohydrate diet. Both are actually followed by 1 day of carb loading. And so you can see in the high carb diet group over the course of that 100-kilometer time trial was actually able to complete it much, much faster than those on the low carbohydrate diet with the kind of repeat sprint kind of performance part of it being impacted the most. Meaning if it's a slow, kind of lower intensity, long distance type of ride, you may not be as impacted by carbohydrate availability if the intensity is low enough, but it's the repeat sprints or the hill climbs that are going to be more impacted by carbohydrate availability or lack thereof if you're not kind of consistently replenishing glycogen that was used during that type of activity. And so again, if we look at different applications or different sports here, if we look at maybe a sport like soccer and kind of compare what happens with muscle glycogen levels kind of throughout that match. So interestingly, if we kind of compared again, soccer players either on a high carb or normal carbohydrate diet, those on a high carb diet are actually able to start that soccer match with a significantly higher muscle glycogen concentration, which we would expect. And then if we look at halftime values, you can see it went from 15 to 4, whereas our normal diet player only had a value of 7, still went down, but now it's all the way down to 1 at halftime, meaning they really don't have any fuel left in the tank to support any kind of second half performance. Because even in the high carb group, they're still near depletion towards the end of that match. My guess is that high carb player, again, probably felt a lot better if we even look at their performance metrics. Those on the high carb diet were able to complete and travel much further, kind of greater overall distance, especially in the second half. And then they also were able to kind of maintain a higher percentage of activity that would be classified as more sprint-based activity. So again, not only are high carb diets important for our endurance type athletes, but then certainly for, again, our intermittent kind of team sport or field sport types of activities as well. Okay, so let's get into some actual recommendations here in specific numbers. So if we look at kind of the dietary guidelines for athletes in general, athletes are going to require a higher daily carbohydrate intake than non-athletes. Hopefully you've kind of picked that up along the way here. But how much is more? That's kind of the magic question. And that really comes down to the type of sport or the type of athlete, the volume of training that they're engaged in, and then the intensity of training. That is what I use and what kind of the evidence-based guidelines would tell you is kind of what you need to identify first in terms of setting up your specific recommendations beyond that. So if we just kind of look at overall diet profiles, in general, you're usually going to see a carbohydrate intake in the range of about 5 to 8 grams per day per kilogram of body weight is kind of what's going to be recommended for a lot of athletes. Maybe a little bit lower for some sports that may not really be as reliant on muscle glycogen or glycolysis, but still usually around that 5 grams per kilo per day mark. And then usually you're going to see a moderate to high protein intake, anywhere from about 1.2 to 2 grams per day, or excuse me, grams per kilogram of body weight per day. And then usually a low-ish fat intake. It's hard to usually use individual based recommendations here, but usually somewhere in the range of zero point 0.5 to 1.5 grams per kilogram of body weight per day. So you take your body weight, convert it to kilograms, multiply it by 5 here. That would kind of give you an idea of how many grams of carbohydrates that you or the athlete should be eating on kind of a per day basis. Usually we recommend kind of the moderate to low glycemic index carbohydrates for most pre kind of exercise or breakfast type feeding opportunities. And then maybe halftime, mid race, mid competition, then we can switch to more of our moderate to high glycemic index sources of carbohydrates. And then even after competition, sometimes sticking with a moderate to high glycemic index carbohydrates to really maximize the body and the muscles sensitivity to uptake those carbohydrates as soon as possible after exercise. And then usually even pairing it with post-exercise or post-competition protein is kind of a win-win, because then you can maximize glucose and protein uptake. One helps restock your fuel supplies. The other one helps jumpstart that recovery process and kind of initiate protein synthesis to recover, repair, or even stimulate muscle growth, depending on what the specific goal happens to be. So stay tuned to part 2 of this lecture. We'll get into more specific recommendations for different carbohydrate intake values based on, again, the type of athlete, the type of sport, the volume of activity, and really the intensity of activity, as we'll use all of those factors to kind of identify what the specific carbohydrate recommendations and feeding strategies are going to be for those different types of athletes.